For many centuries, life in an English village moved at a steady, unchanging pace. The squire lived in his hall, the parson in his parsonage, the innkeeper in the inn on the edge of the village green, and the majority of the population lived in rented accommodation, usually owned by the squire. Alongside their rent, the tenants would spend a certain amount of time each year working the squire's land, and, in return perhaps for a rudimentary education for their sons, they might sometimes work the glebe, the land belonging to the parson. For many centuries, the old three-field system had worked quite well for the poor of rural communities. This was the system in which each village had 3 very large fields, one of which was left fallow each year to allow the earth to regain its goodness. In the other 2 fields, barley, wheat, or some other crop, as agreed by the community, would be grown. Each field was divided into strips, which were managed or owned by individual families. The strips were spread out over different fields, so that the people had a share of good and bad land. And around the fields was the common, where anyone could gather berries, collect wood, graze their animals, or fish in the rivers and streams. The system had many advantages for the rural people. If one had a plough and another an ox, they could combine their assets to work together on each other's strips. There was a sense of community and a shared enjoyment of harvests and other festivals. The parish collected money to provide for those who could no longer work, and entire families, from the youngest child to the eldest grandparent, worked together to eke out a living. There was, of course, a great deal of poverty. The hovels in which many families lived with their scrawny livestock were cold and damp, and a series of bad harvests could lead to famine. But there was also a sort of harmony with nature and a valuable sense of belonging. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the rapid expansion of the towns and cities increased the demand for food. This old agrarian system no longer provided a high enough yield to accommodate the rising population, and little by little centuries-old farming methods, which involved these communities working together, were forcibly replaced by innovative schemes. The fact was that under the old system a great deal of land was wasted. Mounds of earth called balks separated the strips, and if a lazy neighbour left his strips untended, weeds would grow onto a more industrious man's land. There was no opportunity for innovation. If one person wished to grow a different crop, he couldn't do so without the consent of the entire community. The rotation, too, meant that one field was left empty and wasted each year. The Enclosure Acts were meant to rectify this situation. If 3 of the largest landowners in the community wished to create their own farms, they need only apply to Parliament for a right of enclosure. A notice would be posted on the church door announcing that such a petition had been made and allowing the rest of the community to prepare to voice their objections. In fact, since most of the community were illiterate, few ever read the notices, but within a short time government inspectors would arrive to assess exactly who owned what. A proof of ownership was required in the form of a written document, but the problem for illiterate peasants, whose families might have tended the same strips for generations, was that very few would have kept such a document if it had ever existed. With no proof, however, they could be forcibly thrown from their land, and the strips that they had always worked would be amassed into one large farm owned by somebody else. Those who could prove ownership would be given an equivalent amount of land in one place rather than having separate strips of land all over the village. This could then be turned into a farm, but the cost of fencing and enclosing the farm, as well as the legal fees of £30, was more than many could afford. Without the income from their strips, they could no longer afford to pay their rent, and were subsequently evicted. In the past, these people might have turned to the parish for relief, but now so many were claiming this benefit that parishes could no longer afford to keep them. Moreover, laws were passed to prevent them moving to a neighbouring parish, and since the common land too had been enclosed, many were left with no alternative but to go into the city and look for work. In my novel, The Fields Laid Waste, I follow a family from the fictional Yorkshire village of Lowkirk into the city of Leeds. In the next video in this series, I will talk about what happened when such families arrived in the city. Thank you for listening.